Welcome everyone. Welcome to the LSE for this online event, which is part of this year's LSE Festival, Shaping the Post-COVID World. A week of virtual events that are free and open to all, taking place this week until Saturday, 6th of March. And it's about the direction the world could and should be taking after the COVID crisis and how social science research can help shape it. My name is Chris Anderson, and I'm a professor in European politics and policy here at the London School of Economics and Political Science. This year, the festival is adapting to the new normal, the next normal, some kind of a normal, with all events being held online and streamed via Zoom and the Festival Hub, which is the online home of the LSE Festival. Make sure you visit the Festival Hub to access all festival content, including our series of live events via Zoom, as well as a series of pre-recorded 10-minute talks with LSE faculty, Festival Shorts, they're called. The full program can be found at lse.ac.uk/festival. So I'm very pleased to be here to introduce our speakers to you today. We have three of my very favorite people here at the LSE. I'm going to start with Peter Trubowitz, who's Professor of International Relations and Director of the US Center at the LSE. He writes and comments frequently on US politics, and his interests lie in international security and US foreign policy. Then we have Sara Hobolt, who is the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions and Professor in the Department of Government. She is co-author, among other things, of a new book called Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. And her interests lie in elections, public opinion, and EU politics. And last but never least is Florian Foos, who is Assistant Professor in Political Behavior, also in the Department of Government, who studies partisan election campaigns with interest in opinion change, political activism, and electoral mobilization. Tonight, the panel will be discussing political polarization within different contexts over the course of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, for those of you who are Twitter users in the audience, please feel free to make use of the hashtag. Today's event's hashtag is hashtag LSE Festival. It's very simple, LSE Festival. This online event is being recorded, just so you know, and will hopefully be made available as a podcast subject to no technical difficulties, which we of course know never arise during this world this Zoom land that we inhabit. In any case, I'll soon hand over to each of our speakers, and then as usual, there will be a chance for you, the audience, to put your questions to the panel. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to myself, and I will then pose as many as possible to the speakers in the time that we have. Please let us know your name and affiliation. We're particularly keen to hear from our students, alumni, and incoming students, of course, so please let us know who you are. The title of our session is How the Pandemic Polarized Us. Now, one question I would ask off the bat is, has the pandemic polarized us? But for now, I will be quiet and I will hand it over to Professor Peter Trubowitz, who will be telling us about polarization in the United States. Go for it, Peter.
Great, thanks, Chris. It's good to be with you and everyone else on the platform this evening. So my charge is to briefly discuss how the pandemic has changed American political life. And there's a lot to say on the topic and little time to say it in. But in the hopes of sparking some discussion, let me make 3 points. One, having to do with the pandemic's effect on the partisan divide in the United States. So I'll take up Chris's question there. One, having to do with the pandemic's effect on the 2020 presidential contest. And one having to do with the pandemic's effect on America's role in the world. On the first point, while COVID has changed many things in the United States, most of the research shows that the pandemic did not drive the nation's partisan wedge deeper. America was already divided along partisan lines. And while there were and remain partisan differences in behavioral responses to the pandemic, that is over social distancing, wearing masks, A large Stanford study that was released in October, last October, indicates that the level of partisan polarization last fall was roughly the same as it was before the outbreak of the pandemic in the United States. Now, that political rift is larger in the US than in other established democracies. But at the end of the day, polarization has parsed the pandemic and not the other way around. This is not to say that it hasn't influenced American politics. It has, which brings me to the second point. In my view, there's a very good chance that Donald Trump would still be president if he didn't make such a hash of managing the pandemic. Indeed, when it comes to the all-important Electoral College, a change of only 43,000, just under actually, 43,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona would have given Trump the 270 electoral votes needed to win a presidential election. That margin just, is smaller than the 77,000 plus votes that cost Clinton, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania 4 years earlier. Now, political scientists are going to be studying Trump's defeat for years to come, but I'll wager here tonight that one of the things these studies will show is that Trump lost because of incompetence. Not the incompetence of voters and voting machines as Trump would have it, but his own incompetence as a leader. Trump's failure to acknowledge the gravity of the pandemic early on was not due to ignorance. We know that he was aware that it wasn't going to simply disappear magically. Even if he was not fully aware of how bad it would get if he didn't mobilize the federal government to move quickly and systematically impose best practices such as face masks and social distancing. Trump's failure to basically worst case the pandemic from the get-go is really one of the unexplained mysteries of the pandemic in the United States. And my sense is that it was all about blame avoidance. Trump focused more on how an all hands on deck response to the unfolding crisis would impact the stock market more than on the infection rate and the death toll. And this is why he pushed back, if you will, or pulled back on the federal throttle and delegated as much responsibility as possible to the states so that governors would take the blame for the infection rate and the death count. From the vantage point of practical politics, it was, to paraphrase Talleyrand, worse than a crime, it was a mistake. And that's because Americans were more focused on the infection and death rate than the stock market's ups and downs. In my view, if Trump had done more and done it sooner, voters would have been more forgiving. It wouldn't have guaranteed Trump's reelection, but Trump's failure was a failure of competency. And if there is one thing that still gets you fired in the United States pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic, most of the time, it's incompetency. Trump's mismanagement of the pandemic isn't the only problem he left in Joe Biden's inbox. He's also handed him something of a foreign policy that commands little respect abroad from America's allies, to be sure, but also its adversaries. The problems here are many, and certainly America's poor performance in managing the pandemic has hurt it in the eyes of world opinion. But back home, the central challenge facing Biden on the foreign policy front lies elsewhere. It is to find a way to reconnect achievements in the international realm to recognizable benefits for average Americans. Trump talked a good game about this problem, but he arguably made it worse. Biden has promised to rebuild support for American international engagement. He's been telling everyone and anyone who will listen that America's back, just in case you haven't heard it. For Biden to make good on this pledge, though, he needs to find ways to make what the United States is doing abroad pay dividends once again for a broad cross-section of its citizens. Now, this would be difficult in the best of times, but the pandemic makes it especially challenging. In my view, Biden has to do several things on the international front to make good on his pledge, including working more closely with allies on climate, China, and human rights. But the single most important thing he needs to do is get the pandemic under control at home and leverage the crisis to rebuild the country's infrastructure and create more non-tradable jobs for working American families. This will go a long way towards easing domestic anxiety about America's international engagement. The pandemic is a crisis, but like all crises, it's also an opportunity. And my hope is that Biden will capitalize on it. And Chris, why don't I leave it there for now?
Thank you very much, Peter. That was very interesting, and you got us off to a wonderful start here. I'm going to hand the baton over to Professor Sara Hobolt now.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Peter. So I think what Peter said was that polarization in the US didn't stem from the crisis, and I think I'm now going to move back home to the United Kingdom, and I will go one step further and say not only did the crisis not cause polarization in the UK, in fact, perhaps it brought us, at least for a little while, back together. And to do that, I'm going to sort of take a very short trip down memory lane with you and say, where were we when this all started at the beginning of 2020, and what preceded that in terms of public opinion and polarization in the UK. And I'll show you a few slides here, if you don't mind, to take us on that small journey. So let me share my slides with you here. So it's this, the idea is, or my argument is that not only didn't the pandemic polarize us in the UK, perhaps it brought us back together. And what did it bring us back together from? Well, I'm sure you can all remember that when the pandemic hit these shores in early 2020, the British public had just, the United Kingdom had just formally left the European Union, but it was not an issue that in any way was settled or over. Britain was highly polarized politically, but perhaps more importantly in the public. A new identity had emerged over the preceding 4.5 years, where people were increasingly seeing themselves as Remainers or Leavers. I have a graph here showing that over 3/4 of people identified in that way. And that was not just a political identity, but one that was highly divisive. It was also one, I'm showing here another graph that shows that it was one that was at that point in time more strongly held than partisan identities. So people were more likely to see themselves and describe themselves as a Leaver or Remainer than they were a conservative or Labour supporter or Liberal Democrat. And they felt these identities more strongly. It also spills over into something that we've seen a lot of in the United States, which is sometimes called affective polarization, which is an animosity towards the other, the out group, towards those, if you're a Remainer, towards Leavers, and if you're a Leaver, towards Remainers. Now, what happened then with the pandemic? Well, in some ways, there's some evidence that it did bring us back together. First of all, Brexit became just a lot less salient because all of a sudden it was all about coronavirus, COVID, and the policy action to combat that. There was also across Europe and the world a kind of rally around the flag effect, because you had this external threat. And what often happens to public opinion when you have that is that people rally around the flag, or in this case, also around the incumbent. Now, that meant even in the US, actually, Trump became more important in the very beginning of the first wave, and so did Boris Johnson. Also, if we look here at this graph that shows government approval ratings in the United Kingdom, the government had been very unpopular during a lot of the Brexit negotiation period and became during the first wave of the pandemic much more popular. That didn't last, and that comes back to one of the very important points that Peter made, namely competence, or rather incompetence, that as it happened, people start feeling that the government wasn't handling the pandemic in a competent manner. That led to higher levels of disapproval again. But certainly to start off with, people were very much behind the government. Now, on top of that, what also happened is that even though disapproval ratings started being on the increase again, nonetheless, there's actually been a very broad consensus around the government's government policies on COVID. And again, here, I think there's a contrast to the United States, where there's been a lot more divisions in terms of the levels of support for lockdown, and in terms of and partisan behavior, partisan divisions also in behavioral patterns and compliance with social distancing rules. What we've seen in the UK throughout this pandemic is high levels of support for very stringent policies, including lockdowns, including wearing masks and so on, and no real partisan or Brexit divide in that. So really, it doesn't matter whether you're Conservative or Labour supporter, whether you're Leave or Remainer. Generally, people are supportive of these social distancing measures, and generally they're highly supportive of lockdown measures, even though I'm sure we can all recognize that it's not always been a walk in the park. So again, we see going from this divided Brexit Britain to a COVID consensus. And just to end up here, then there's this question, well, is that then the new normal in the United Kingdom? Are we over these divisions that we lived with for almost 5 years? Well, on the one hand, Brexit has become a lot less salient, although of course it's not entirely off the agenda. And there has been this consensus around policy that we didn't see for several years. But there are also reasons to believe that this consensus might not last. First of all, what we are going to be facing in the next few years, I mean, none of us know for sure, but certainly is an economic downturn and very likely rising unemployment as some of the government measures that are now in place are no longer in place, and also the difficult choices that we will see around the budget in terms of taxation and so on. So we might not have the Brexit divide, but we are likely to have an increasing economic divide. More with the cultural divide we saw with Brexit has not gone away. There will still be questions about what do we do about foreign aid, what do we do about immigration, and so on in new trade deals. So in that sense, while the pandemic, as it was an imminent threat, brought us back together, that doesn't mean that the divisions that partly caused the divisions around Brexit will not come back and haunt us, and we will become more polarized again. So I will leave it there and stop sharing here. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sara. That was very interesting. It's nice to see the contrast too with the United States. And so at this point, I'll hand it over to Dr. Florian Foos from the Government Department. Go for it.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks for having me. On the one hand, I would say I agree actually with Sara Hobolt on her point that, you know, overall, the big majority of people does support social distancing measures, you know, supports, at least in this country, the vaccination program. And so we have seen a certain, you know, extent of consensus really on important questions of public policy. Economic policy would be another one, the support for basically, you know, basically measures to sustain businesses, also the furlough scheme, for instance. I think one qualification I would make is that differs between countries. I would say if you, for instance, if you look at support for vaccination in France, opinion is much more divided than it is in this country. And I would also say that even though a majority of people agrees, and we don't really have that polarization into kind of two big camps, right? What we have is that there is quite a vocal minority, right? I mean, of people who, first of all, you know, disagree with social distancing measures, people who are unhappy about the policy, right? I mean, pursued by the government, but also people who are unhappy with the way policy has been made during the pandemic. So with the democratic and the political process. And I can give you an example from the country where I was born, Germany, which is a lot of for instance, a lot of decisions in the pandemic have been made by the executive, basically in a tandem between the federal government and the state prime ministers, really, and the legislature had relatively little say in COVID, based policy, lockdown policy, for instance. Now that has changed, basically gradually moving forward, but at least there was the beginning at the start of the pandemic. And so there is actually quite a bit of skepticism towards, like how democratic, for instance, decisions are that have been made during the pandemic. And so what we did, and I also want to show a couple of slides with you, show you some results of a study that my co-author Alexander Wuttke and I have conducted now just in December and January 2020, January 2021, where we worked together with politicians in Germany of 5 parties, doing town halls, basically online town halls like we are today on Zoom, where we recruited subjects, or in this case, citizens from Facebook. The idea was not to get a representative sample of people, but to get basically a sample of people who, heterogeneous sample, you have a lot of different opinions, but also people who are dissatisfied basically with COVID policy, but also with the way that decisions on COVID were made in the basically in Germany. Let me just share my slides with you now. And so the idea here was that we ran 2 different types of town halls together, collaborating with politicians and representatives. The first type of town hall was politicians just went about the town hall in the way they liked. They would take questions on COVID-based policy and interact with citizens attending the town hall. The second type of town hall that politicians ran was based really on democratic processes. And there they emphasized that not everything had gone well in the pandemic. And at first, for instance, there was too much of a focus on basically executive decision making. But that basically, politicians were working through that, and that, basically decision patterns had improved over the pandemic. Independent courts had assured that mistakes that were made were corrected. And basically that, democracy, while it's not perfect, actually did lead to, in the end, relatively good outcomes. So what you see here are some results actually of that study. So what you see in the right panel is always our town hall that focused on democracy. We call that democratic talk. And on the left, you see the town hall, which we call the control town hall, where, citizens just interacted with politicians. The outcome here on the y-axis is support for COVID-based restrictions, social distancing measures. And what you see is that if politicians in this town hall here on the right address, underlying democratic issues, decision-making processes openly, then you actually see an increase in support for those restrictions. Yeah. So what do we make of that? First of all, what's the effect size? It's about 1 in 10 people changing their opinions in supporting further restrictions or supporting for further social distancing. What do we make of that? Well, some of the opposition to those measures, not all of it, right? But some of it might be based on opposition to the democratic processes by which, those, or by some of the processes by which those decisions have been arrived at. This is trust in government. Again, the same patterns. Basically, people who attended the town hall were politicians, and I should say that this weren't only government politicians as well. It was half of them were basically representing governing parties. The other half were representing opposition parties. But when citizens attended those town halls that addressed democratic processes during the pandemic, trust in government went up. Trust in the government's COVID policy and handling of the COVID pandemic. And finally, this is satisfaction with democracy. Again, you see an increase in satisfaction with democracy amongst those people that attended the town hall where politicians explicitly made a case for democracy while acknowledging some of the of the issues that had existed in the pandemic. Again, this is data from Germany. It's a study we just basically finished last month, and I would look forward obviously to take any questions of that. But my takeaway is really that there is a minority basically of people who are unsatisfied with policy, but also with processes, and not all of them are lost in that kind of sense, right? I mean, like not all people. That doesn't mean that these are all like they're all really rejecting what is going on, but there are some that are criticizing the processes, and politicians can actually do something to basically win them over and win them over on those democratic processes. Thanks. Chris, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Excellent. And this is, of course, very typically what happens during any Zoom call with everyone. Somebody doesn't unmute themselves. Thank you, Florian, for that really hot off the press social science research to share with our audience. We've come to the fun part of the evening. I think we have a whole bunch of questions already that have come up through the chat. So if it's okay with the panelists, I'm going to get right to it. I think there's a couple of really interesting ones that perhaps Peter can take, and they revolve around Trump and Biden. There is a, let me see it here if I can find it really quickly. There's a question from Cordula Reimann from Switzerland, who asks about, let me see it really quickly, if I can find it. If we see the corona crisis as an opportunity to overcome the polarization, I guess is I think what she's saying. What are Biden's concrete plans to overcome that polarization? What is it that he can do kind of specifically as president to help overcome any kind of polarization? And related to that, there was a question from John Newham, I believe, who sort of poses the really interesting hypothetical of if Trump had won, and as you say, he came really close, would that have really exacerbated things?
So, two very good questions, and I invite my panelists to jump in if they want to. So one is the counterfactual. So what can Biden do to reduce the level of toxicity in American politics? I think the first thing is he needs to, as I said, he has to get the pandemic under control. He has to demonstrate that government can work, that the federal government can work. And he needs to use this to address some very deep issues in the United States, particularly inequality and social justice. But essentially what this really boils down to in terms of what he can do is he can use the COVID relief package, which he will do, and there will be an infrastructure package that they will try to push through afterwards within the next month to two, which will also be huge. And if they have their way, there'll be a climate bill that follows that. That's a lot to get through. These are very, very big price tag items. But all of these can be geared to building jobs. And the COVID package is, the infrastructure package will definitely be organized that way. So that's the first thing. I would say, although this will raise some partisan tensions in the short run in the United States, Biden needs to do something to ensure that people are enfranchised in terms of voting. There's been a lot of voter disenfranchisement in the United States, and there are bills pending right now that, if pushed through, will undo a lot of the damage that actually was done by the Supreme Court and that has been done at the state level. So those are things I think that kind of longer term would lead to kind of greater buy-in and commitment to the US government, to the electoral process, and so forth. If Trump had been reelected, I think it would have poured additional gasoline on the flames in the United States. But I think we would have seen internationally even more peeling off, clearly just peeling off from the United States. The conclusion that would have been drawn, the issue in Trump's first term was he a one-off, or is this the state of things to come? Xenophobia, nativism, nationalism, protectionism in the United States. Merkel framed that question very directly. If he had been reelected, that would have been the answer. He wasn't reelected, but it was close.
Sara, do you want to jump in? If not, yes, I think I want to add something to this. So maybe more generally, I think does it matter what politicians say or what kind of policies they support? I think it does a lot, right? I think one reason why we are seeing what Sara Hobolt basically outlined before, which is a relatively broad consensus, is because also political elites seem to be quite united on COVID policy and strategy. That wasn't the case in the beginning of the pandemic, when the government thought about going into a totally different direction, right? But now it seems to be the case that the Labour Party is supporting a lot of what the government is doing. I mean, even Nigel Farage, right? I mean, has said recently, supporting the vaccination strategy of the government. So, it's basically from the extreme left to really the radical right. You see a relative consensus on the big kind of, nobody's opposing the furlough. That there's a lot of elite consensus, and I think that also trickles down. And that's not the case everywhere in all other countries. Yeah, so you have obviously the United States would be a good counterpoint. Peter.
I have a two-finger on that, but I want to wait if Sara wants to jump in. No? So just quickly on this point, to go back to that Stanford study, which actually reinforces what Sara showed and what the point that Florian just made. There was initially, they tracked it, attitudes, effective attitudes over time. And what they showed was that there was initially a rally around the flag effect in the United States too. And so while not exactly unity, there was much less partisanship. And then post the murder of George Floyd, that dissipated. And so, and partly this is a leadership issue, to go to Florian's problem, because Trump poured gasoline on that. And so these two issues got like intertwined in a way that jacked everything back up again. I mean, it jacked the polarization up again.
Thank you, Peter. I think there's some questions here that relate to the healthcare system. So interestingly, there was a question from Ivanka Anand, who's an MSc student in economic history, who is an alumna, I apologize. And she asks, what role do you think the healthcare system plays across these different countries in terms of the different extents to which the publics may have reacted positively or negatively to the coronavirus? And then perhaps as an add-on for Sara too, kind of the extent to which the success of the vaccination program in the UK may help assuage any kind of real tendency for polarization to kind of reemerge very quickly. What do you guys think?
On the last point, certainly I didn't comment on it with the graph, but I showed this graph on government approval, where there was this rally around the flag in the UK around the Conservative government and Boris Johnson in the beginning. Then we had the crisis around, the very high death toll, issues around PPE, also issues around whether or not certain government advisors felt they were somehow above, were we really all in this together? So there was various kind of scandals and bad news, and that comes back to this point about competence or incompetence. And of course, now what we've seen in the UK is that the government has, and the NHS has been very successful comparatively, and also I guess in all, beyond all expectations, I think, in terms of the vaccine rollout. And we are seeing that now in government approval figures. Now the question is, so certainly that is picked up, and it's sort of interesting because if we look in terms of death toll, of course, Britain is still the worst in Europe by quite far, but nonetheless, people are like, well, at least this is the government and the Conservative Party is still is now quite far ahead, or certainly ahead consistently in the polls, which does make me sort of think back to this point that Peter made. Oh, if Trump had, there's also a certain timing in this, that when, there is the memory in terms of competence, that down the line, what will the government be rewarded and punished for? There's a long time until the next election in the UK. And what will maybe be the big question there is not about vaccinations or about death toll, but maybe about the economic recovery. And that then goes to this question of, will the vaccination strategy be the one that polarizes or brings it back together? I mean, I think the very big question that is so hard for us to answer is how is this economic recovery going to shape out, and also how is it going to be affecting people differently? We already see deep inequalities in COVID in terms of who is more, just in terms of morbidities, but also in terms of who professionals like us who can work from home versus people who lose their jobs or who are more exposed in their day-to-day lives. So there's inequalities there, but there will also be inequalities as we come out of this pandemic. And how the government responds to that, I think, will be really crucial in terms of whether or not this is going to be polarizing long-term, or whether it's going to be a sort of post-Second World War moment where there was a building of the welfare state. Is there going to be that kind of rebuilding as a nation? We're all in it together, or is there going to be just exacerbating the deep inequalities that already exist in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, if I can come in on the question of what if the type of healthcare system matters. I think it's not really straightforward. I think at the beginning, it was, I think, less the type, but more like the resources that the healthcare system had and the capacity it had, right? I mean, like whether it had been funded adequately over the past couple of years. So I think once COVID hit, it became relatively clear, like how many ICU beds there were, right? I mean, like how many staff there were. Also, like where one staff, for instance, were no longer able, like basically to attend because they were sick. So I think it was a resource issue, and some systems are better resourced than others, and the UK system was not particularly well resourced. On the other hand, now when I look towards vaccination, it's actually interesting, right? I mean, you have the UK on the one hand, highly centralized system, obviously public system. You have the US, highly decentralized private, and they seem both to be doing relatively well when it comes to vaccinations. Though I would basically mention the caveat that the US actually, I mean, the vaccination program is really centrally run, right? I mean, like, so the federal government has had like, a huge, really also, I think, stake in this. So I think states have, as nations or regions do in the UK, they have a say on what's going
on. Those are two really interesting responses. Let me just kind of pick up on Florian's last point and maybe go back to Sara's in the US context. It is the vaccination program is being run centrally now. I mean, if you go back to the counterfactual, God knows, one doesn't really know how this would have played out. But it is, in the news that broke today about Merck working with Johnson & Johnson to actually roll out the vaccine. So this is the one-shot vaccine. And this is like almost unprecedented to have two huge pharmaceutical companies cooperating like this. And this was basically done by the White House, has engineered this arrangement. So, it kind of, I think when people see that kind of movement in the United States, it makes me think that they will think, the healthcare system, it's got potential, it's got promise, geez, if it were more kind of centrally directed, and less fragmented and decentralized, maybe that would be a good thing. On the other hand, there's a study out by John Sides and his colleagues. It came out in November, that shows, so one of the things the study shows is that partisanship did not decrease because of the pandemic. And so that study is similar to the Stanford study that way. But they also asked questions about attitudes towards healthcare reform and whether Americans would be more amenable to an NHS, a universal care kind of system, or Medicare for all, something along those lines. And the answer is it broke down along partisan lines. So I think it's going to still be, if Biden wants to push it in that direction, it's going to be a tough slog in the United States.
Can I speak about the tough slog for just a second? So underlying several of the questions that we've had, and we've had a number of really interesting questions, underlying these questions is the assumption that polarization is bad, that polarization is a kind of dysfunction. And it's a dysfunction that prevents maybe swift, efficient decision-making, consensual decision-making, and the ability to react to a pandemic in a way that a democratic society needs to in order to overcome a threat like a pandemic. And so Ariadne Schulz asks sort of what will be the impact of polarization to the extent that it exists on recovery, sort of the ability to recover economically going forward. And related to that, I wanted to ask a question from Han-Lin Lee, who's an LSE undergraduate, who asks about differences between democratic and undemocratic or less democratic country. And specifically, they refer to China and the ability to exert control in the face of a pandemic threat. I think most of us on the panel will say we like living in a democracy, but with living in a democracy perhaps comes this risk of disagreement, that we act out openly. And does that get in the way? What do you guys think about that? Who wants to take that one? Sara.
Well, I mean, I'm really interested in this this question on polarization. And as social scientists, I guess we normally sort of like to define our terms and all these things. And of course, I think that the kind of polarization that we've talked about, can be damaging, but polarization in terms of living in a democracy and having a range of choice can also be a very good thing. The fact that you can go to the ballot box and you don't just have one party or two parties that say the same thing. And that's ultimately, and that leads to the question, it's ultimately also about accountability. That if we have Donald Trump and we think he's incompetent, otherwise in terms of the handling of the pandemic, we have another choice. So that is also an upshot, that having political competition, I think we would generally agree, is a very good thing for democracy. And the opposite, like total convergence even, is not necessarily a good thing for democracy. On the other hand, polarization, in the way that I hear many of us on this panel having talked about it, spills over also in one where also citizens have very entrenched positions and are so deeply steeped in their identification with those positions, for example, being a Democrat or Republican, that it also starts impeding accountability and democracy, because, and that comes then to the question about what does that do for recovery, because it means we can no longer look critically at our own the party, for example, that we support. So if you are, let's say, a Democrat that is so strong in the belief that only ever the Democrats can be the savior and they can only ever do good, it means we stop being critical of anything, for example, Biden would do, or similarly, if we are strong conservative supporters. So when political competition and partisanship becomes the kind of polarization where we dislike the outgroup, the other side, so much that we can no longer be critical of our own side, I think then it becomes a problem both for democracy, but also for how we hold politicians to account. Just a very short point on whether or not democracies, and there were a lot of sort of debate about that, could democracies impose the kind of things that we might think that autocratic regimes could do? And what has been fascinating, I think, is that if you look at some of the measures that have been imposed in established democracies, basically telling people they will get fined if they say hello to another friend, linger around, if they don't wear a mask, if they get too close. I mean, these are things we could not have imagined a year ago. And people, not only people accept it and comply, but they in fact support it. So, I mean, of course, it requires probably more communication to do this in a democracy, but it certainly shows that democratic regimes have amazing capacity to make people follow, go along with things that are that might worry us, and we can talk about that, but democratic regimes certainly have the capacity to do that. Especially when, as Florian said, there's a strong consensus, elite consensus, but also scientific consensus behind it, and when people feel there's a threat.
Thank you. Peter, do you have an opinion on this?
I do, but Florian, I'm happy to go or wait.
Just one thought, maybe. I think a level of disagreement is important, right? I mean, because government make mistakes, politicians make mistakes, and some governments make more mistakes than others, and they need to be held accountable, right? And also in a crisis, as Trump has been held accountable now in November, and I thought it was actually concerning that some elections had been postponed, right? I mean, like when basically the crisis hit, and there was a debate on when actually elections would be held again. So I understood, right? I mean, in the very beginning, just given the health situation, that this had to be done. But I think it's a good thing, right? I mean, that we're having elections again, that we're having elections in May, right? I mean, local elections in Wales and Scotland, and that people get to have a say, right? I mean, on this kind of things. So yeah, I totally agree that this level of debate is important.
I think I could talk about the first question till the cows come home, but I think I'll focus on the second one in the interest of time, the China-related question. So this is my second pandemic. I was living in Beijing with my family during the SARS pandemic, teaching at one of the universities there. And we stayed through the pandemic. And our kids continued to go to school, and for a period of time they were out. And there are a couple things about the Chinese response then and more recently in this pandemic that I think stand out for me. Kudos to them when they finally get their act together. They know how to kind of snuff it out pretty fast. It was impressive when all the universities went into lockdown back in 2003, and the way that they dealt with it. But one of the problems with a system like that is that when you have lack of transparency, it's on the front end. It took a long time to find out that there was a problem. And then it took a long time to do something about it. And there was a lot of kind of blame avoidance and blame blame attribution going on between the central government and the local governments. And it really slowed things down. And so the problem ended up being much worse than it needed to be, and that it probably would have been in a more open democratic society. One other thing to just say here, we should remember that plenty of democracies have done a pretty good job with this. New Zealand, Australia, not too bad. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. There's a pretty long list. It's true also that Singapore has done a good job in, kind of controlling it, and China, and even in the European context, some of the more populist, if you will, authoritarian states. But it's a very mixed story, and I think it's way too early to draw broad generalizations.
That's a very good point. And I think one of the wonderful things about having an event like the LSE Festival is that we can kind of talk about current events as they happen, sort of, right, on the fly. But I think you're absolutely right in saying, we have to say this as social scientists, is that we need to collect a lot more evidence to draw strong conclusions about what's happening in the world. There's two types of questions here that I really want to get to before the end of the event. And one of them is a more local question, and one of them is a more global question. The more local question comes from Charlie Duffield, who asks, it's been reported that there's been a huge upsurge in people volunteering and helping their local communities. What is the psychological reason or motivation for this? And do you think this will continue, or will it just go away and subside when the pandemic subsides? What do our experts think about that? And then I have a global question to follow up on that. I think this one goes to Florian immediately. When I saw that question, I thought, I want to hear what Florian has to say about this.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Got
Chris.
Florian written all over it.
Yes.
So I think the two aspects to this. If we think about like why people volunteer or what motivates them to volunteer, one of them is resources as well, right? And people had more time. They had more time because they weren't furloughed, they stayed home. People basically also had to, I think, look for something meaningful to do, right? I mean, during lockdown, especially those of you who might, not have kids and, like be busy, basically otherwise, or carrying responsibilities. And so I think that might have contributed to that. But on the other hand, it's also obviously people are impacted, right? I mean, like, they will know people, especially if you live in the UK. I think that also differs quite a bit across country. I mean, we have seen really high death toll rates. We have seen lots of people going to hospital. So you'll probably know somebody, or know somebody who knows somebody, basically, who has been affected. And I think that might have really, stimulated people to get active and to contribute, even at the very kind of local level and on a smaller scale, helping neighbors, delivering groceries for people, this kind of things. Like mutual aids have sprung up all over South London, for instance, where I live. But I think that also depends a little bit on actually how, I would imagine, it's my hypothesis, I haven't tested it empirically, but on how hard the country or region was hit, and how many people you actually also know that would need help. So that there's two aspects to time on the one hand, and then basically the motivation coming from like being impacted or knowing people who are impacted.
But let me follow up on it. Do you think it's going to go away as things get better, as the economy recovers, as inequalities perhaps among people who are ill and not so ill, or affected by the pandemic and not affected by the pandemic, for instance, with regard to having children in school and so on? If once that kind of peters out, will we see these mutual aid societies that you describe seeing in South London? Will that just poof, disappear?
I would hope not, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, once you have started doing something, you are probably more likely to keep doing it, especially maybe if you have met friends, right? Or now your neighbors. I'm actually kind of came to get to know more of my neighbors just locally, right? I mean, even though we weren't able to kind of mix, but you just walk by, or there's a WhatsApp group now where I live, basically in the house. So I think these kind of things, like personal connections, sustain volunteering. And once you have tried it, I think there's also a threshold, right, of entry. So often people were too busy, or they thought they were too busy to do this kind of things. But once you have tried it, maybe you like it, right, and you continue doing that. So I think some of it will go away because people will, people's life will change and they will normalize to some extent. But I think not all of it.
Go for it, Peter. And I do want to get to the global question, so make it
I'm
quick.
going to just be very quick on this, because I don't know the answer. I mean, I think what Florian had to say is very interesting. I think, this is an area that would really be worth researching and spending time on. And you could do this by looking at responses to natural disasters like tornadoes in the US, or hurricanes, or, typhoons elsewhere, to see, because my guess is that the responses the extent to which that community level response lasts probably varies and under different kinds of conditions that have to do with the existing community infrastructure, maybe the role of federal governments. I'm not sure, but I know we have a lot of government BSc students on here. This would be a really interesting thing to do a dissertation on, to research it, I think.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. And also, it's a great idea, right? I mean, like looking at, the pandemic still is to some extent extraordinary because of just the time it lasted, right? It's still lasting. Right. So a lot of these, and everybody is kind of impacted, right? I mean, by that, it's not localized in that sense. But then, yeah, I mean, there have been, I think about Katrina, right? I mean, in the United States, for instance, and those communities, basically St. Louis and St. Orleans that have been impacted there. I would imagine that. I mean, it's definitely testable whether there have been, volunteering has sprung up and it has been sustained into the future.
Speaking of it affecting everyone, right? The pandemic having affected everyone on this planet. Of course, the immediate flip side of that coin that I just asked Florian is, has this pandemic polarized us globally, or has it brought us together in some important way? I think that's a really fitting question to ask at the very end here. Sara, do you have a view on that?
Well, it certainly hasn't. I mean, I wouldn't say it's on the one hand, it's something that affects all of us, and in a way, we're all in the same boat. So it should have brought us together, because we know that given how globalized the world is, if someone has it in China or New Zealand or in Russia, it can affect us. If a new variant develops in Brazil or in Kent, it can affect someone else. So it should have brought us together. But has it? I don't think, if we look at the vaccination rollout as it's happening, or in the way in which the rich developed world is buying all these vaccines and how slow it has been in terms of rolling out elsewhere in developing countries. So far, there's not a lot of evidence that it has meant that people are really sort of looking at this, that governments are looking at this as a global problem. I think still most of the solutions have been done very much as a national problem. And of course, that comes back to the question of democracy we already talked about. Politicians want to be re-elected by their voters. So even though as a virus that's global and where we should have looked to global solutions, I'm not seeing that. I mean, again, Peter is really the expert here, but from where I'm standing, it's still politicians appealing to their own voters on a very local basis rather than this bringing us together globally.
Peter, what do you think?
I'll
give you the last word on this.
Well, I'll be fast, maybe. So I think I don't really disagree with what Sara said. I think the verdict is still out. I mean, the initial response has not been very uplifting. There's been a lot of nationalism. The drawbridges went up, kind of a lot of pandemic nationalism. But it's still, in a sense, early, and there is evidence of kind of a change going on. We see it with China. We actually see it with Russia in moving, at France most recently in making the vaccine available. And I think we're beginning to see movement in the United States. This takes leadership, and one has to just hope that with time, a lot of the advanced industrialized nations will really kind of begin to get their act together on this.
I think that is a very fitting ending to a really, really interesting discussion. It's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to you guys debate these issues. But I think for all of you listening here today, to listen to Peter, Sara, and Florian. So thank you very much for taking part. We're really grateful you found the time to participate, given the busy schedules I know you all have. Everyone listening, please make sure you check out the festival program. We have a wonderful series of live and pre-recorded events taking place. See you next time.
Right.